My name is Eleanor Hartley. I am 31 years old. And for the past 9 years, 3 months, and 4 days, I have been waiting. Not the kind of waiting where you sit beside a window watching for someone to come home. Not the kind of waiting where hope keeps you company and the hours move in a gentle, ordinary rhythm. No, the kind of waiting I am talking about is different. It is the kind that hollows you out at first, takes everything soft inside you and replaces it, slowly, deliberately, with something harder and more purposeful. The kind of waiting where you become something over the years, where you study and plan and build and grieve in the dark where no one can see you. And you wake up every single morning with one thought so fixed in your mind that it has become less like a thought and more like a compass needle, always pointing the same direction. No matter how much you turn, I became a woman who unpicks lies for a living. I became a woman who understands how money moves through shadow companies and offshore accounts and the elaborate, expensive theater that powerful people construct around their crimes. I became, very quietly and without announcing it to anyone, exactly the kind of person you would need to be if you wanted to dismantle what Sebastian Whitmore had spent 9 years believing was untouchable. I returned to Whitmore on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I chose Tuesday deliberately because I have always believed, and this perhaps tells you something about the kind of person grief and purpose together produce, that Tuesdays are the days the world forgets to pay attention. Mondays are watched closely. Fridays are anticipated. But Tuesdays slip past. Nothing important is supposed to happen on a Tuesday. That is exactly why I chose it. The drive into Whitmore took 4 hours from London. I had done the route in my head 100 times over the years. Not as a journey I was planning. Not as a fantasy of return, but simply because certain roads belong to you in the way that childhood places always do, whether you want them to or not. The last 20 miles were the ones I knew best. The long straight stretch past the reservoir. The dip into the valley where the road narrows and the hedges press close on both sides. The first glimpse of the church, spire above the tree line, dot, and then the town itself. The single traffic light blinked amber in the thin morning rain. The bakery on Crescent Street still had the same hand-painted sign, Fletcher's, Est, 1962, though the man who had painted it was long dead. The churchyard's iron gate stood slightly open, the way it always had, as if the dead inside were expected to have somewhere to be. I did not stop to look at any of it. I drove straight to the edge of town, to a 2-story house on Aldermore Lane that I had rented over the telephone without giving my real name. I had paid 3 months in advance with a bank draft. I had packed 2 suitcases, a cardboard box of files, a laptop, and a small leather journal that I had not opened in 4 years because I had not been ready to now. I parked the car. I sat with my hands in my lap and listened to the engine tick as it cooled. And I looked at the wet front garden of the house I would live in for the next several months. The house on the street that shared its name with the trust that had been used to steal £460,000 and frame my father for it. I had chosen this house for that reason too. I am back, I thought. Not with triumph. Not yet. Only with the cold, clear certainty of a woman who has spent 9 years becoming exactly the kind of person she needed to be, and has now arrived at the place where that person is required. What was I here for? I was here because my father died in prison for something he did not do. I was here because the man who arranged it believed that the Martin Hartley affair was ancient, settled, buried history. I was here to show him what happens when the buried things refuse to stay buried. Asterisk. Hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel. And tell us in comment from where are you watching this video. Asterisk. I have not always been this composed. I want you to understand that because what I am going to tell you is a story about who I became. And that story only makes sense if you first understand who I was once. I was the kind of girl who sang too loudly in the car, belting along to songs I only half knew the words to, inventing the rest with tremendous confidence. I was the kind of girl who cried at television commercials, not just the sad ones, but the uplifting ones too. The ones about insurance companies and reunions at airports and old men being visited by their grandchildren. I left sticky notes on the bathroom mirror with messages like, "Today will be wonderful and you are doing brilliantly," and I meant them entirely. I was, in the words that my brother Daniel used once, with great affection, slightly embarrassingly optimistic. I grew up at number 14 Beacon Road, Whitmore, in a house that smelled of my mother's baking and my father's pipe tobacco and the particular brand of lavender. Furniture polish that my mother used on the banister every Sunday without fail, as reliably as the church bells at 11. It was the kind of childhood that looked from the outside exactly like a postcard. Not dramatically wealthy. Not dramatic in any way. Just steady, warm. The kind of ordinary that you don't recognize as extraordinary until you've lost it. My father was Martin George Hartley. He was 51 when everything fell apart. A man of medium height, with dark hair going gray at the temples, reading glasses that lived permanently on the end of his nose, and the particular unhurried patience of someone who believes that if a thing is worth doing, it is worth doing correctly, and that correctly takes as long as it takes. He was a man who kept records, not obsessively, not in the way of someone who doesn't trust the world, but carefully, methodically, in the way of someone who understands that the truth is always in the detail, and that detail should be looked after. He had worked for 22 years at Whitmore & Sons Solicitors, not as an owner, not as a named partner, but as the firm's most senior trust accounts manager. He managed the practical machinery of other people's legal and financial affairs with a precision and a quiet dedication that I think he found genuinely satisfying. The way people find satisfaction in work that is useful and done well. He liked his work. He was good at it. He had given the best part of his professional life to a firm that bore a name he didn't share. And he had done it without resentment, because resentment was not a thing my father carried. Asterisk, my mother. Caroline was the sort of woman around whom houses become homes. She baked. She gardened. She knew everyone on Beacon Road and most of the people on the surrounding streets. And she remembered the names of their children and their dogs and their minor ailments. And she asked after all of them with a genuine interest that people could always tell was not performance. She was, in the language of people who knew her, a kind woman. Not a passive kindness, an active one. The sort that requires effort and chooses to give it anyway. My brother Daniel was 2 years younger than me. He had our mother's dark eyes and our father's stubbornness and a laugh that I can only describe by saying that if you heard it once, in a crowded room from across the room, you would turn around to look for its source, because it was the sound of someone who was genuinely, completely, unselfconsciously happy in that moment. He was 20 years old when everything fell apart, 20 years old and studying architecture at university, which suited him perfectly, because Daniel had always been the person who looked at a blank space and immediately began imagining what could be built in it. The Whitmore family were three. When I was a girl, Reginald Whitmore, the patriarch, 70 years old and built like someone had carved him from something that didn't give. His son Edward, 45, charming in the practiced, deliberate way of people who have identified charm as a professional tool and have spent years refining their use of it. And Edward's wife, Victoria, who had come from money of her own and therefore looked at other people's financial arrangements with a kind of calm, knowing appraisal that was never quite sympathy and never quite contempt. Asterisk. And then there was the fourth Whitmore, technically. Reginald's nephew, Sebastian, 30 years old when my father's trial began. Clever in the way that is genuinely impressive and genuinely dangerous in equal measure. I used to watch him at the occasional function where our paths would cross town events. The kind of things you attend in small towns because everyone attends them. And think that Sebastian Whitmore was the kind of person who was always watching the room, always calculating, always one conversation ahead of wherever the conversation appeared to be. I grew up understanding, in the unspoken way of small-town children, that the Whitmores were not people you looked at directly. You acknowledged their presence the way you acknowledged the sun, aware of the warmth, careful about the brightness. They were the name on the building, the firm that employed your father, The family whose history was older and weightier than your own. You kept your eyes slightly to the side. Then I was 22 years old and freshly graduated with a first-class law degree that my father had worked every Sunday overtime to help pay for. And I made the mistake of looking directly. Asterisk, it began with a letter, not mine. My father's dot, it arrived in October, in an envelope with a Whitmore and Sons letterhead printed neatly on the front. The way official correspondence always arrives looking entirely routine, entirely innocuous. The way the most destructive things in a person's life very often look before you open them. The letter was signed by Edward Whitmore. It accused my father of embezzlement. Specifically, it alleged that Martin Hartley had been systematically siphoning funds from a client trust account over a period of 3 years, totaling £460,000. I remember the evening my father showed it to me with a clarity that I have never lost. The kitchen table, the overhead light, his reading glasses on the end of his nose, which was where they always were, his hands lying perfectly still on either side of the letter, in the way that very frightened people sometimes go still, as though movement might make the thing more real, might confirm it, might somehow tip the balance from impossible to actual dot. My mother was standing by the sink. She did not turn around. I think now that she couldn't, that facing it directly in that first moment was more than she could manage. She was a woman who believed in the essential goodness of the world and had built her entire life on that belief. And the letter on the kitchen table was the first serious challenge to it she had ever received. She stood at the sink with her back to us and did not turn around. "It isn't true," my father said. He said it simply, without drama, without the performed indignation of a person who protests too much. Just a man stating a fact that he did not think should require defense. Every penny in that account is accounted for. I have kept my own records. Every transaction, every transfer, everything. He said this not as a boast, but as a simple statement of practice. This is what I do. This is how I work. This is who I am. And I, 22 years old, freshly armed with my law degree and my father's lifelong faith in institutions and the absolute unshakable certainty of someone who has not yet had reason to doubt it, said, "Then we'll prove it." Asterisk, I have thought about those words a great deal over the past 9 years. The confidence of them, the innocence of them, the way they assumed that truth clearly demonstrated would be sufficient that the machinery of justice was a neutral instrument, and that if you put the correct information into it, the correct outcome would emerge. I was 22 years old. I had not yet learned what happens when the people who operate the machinery have interests of their own. What followed was 6 months of investigation, solicitors' letters, counter-accusations, and a legal process that moved with a slow, indifferent momentum of a glacier, powerful in its movement, impersonal in its destruction. The Whitmores had resources that my father and I simply did not. They had connections within the legal community that meant every door we tried to open had already been spoken to before we arrived. They had, and I became increasingly, then completely, then furiously certain of this, a paper trail that had been manufactured with extraordinary care, meticulous, internally consistent, backed with a kind of documentary detail that is very difficult to challenge without resources we did not have. It pointed squarely, precisely, and comprehensively at my father. What Martin Hartley had was his daughter, his word, his own records, and a faith in due process that he had built up over a lifetime of honest service. It was not enough. He was charged. He was tried in a courtroom that I attended every day, sitting behind him, watching the back of his head as barrister after barrister presented a version of my father that I did not recognize, a man who had been quietly, systematically dishonest, who had exploited his position of trust, who had stolen from the people who had employed him for more than 2 decades, and 12 ordinary people who had tried their best with 400 pages of financial documents that would have challenged a specialist. Returned a verdict of guilty. My father was sentenced to 4 years in prison. He died in the 2nd year, a heart attack. In the prison infirmary on a Tuesday morning in February, my father's name was Martin George Hartley. He was 53 years old. He died having never stopped believing, even in prison, that the truth would eventually come out. I know this because he told me so on the last visit I made before he died. He sat across the table from me with his reading glasses in his pocket because you weren't allowed to wear them in the visiting room. And he looked at me steadily and he said, "Eleanor, the records tell the truth. They always do, eventually. You mustn't stop believing that." He was right. I just had to find the records. The grief that followed my father's death was not the clean, tearful kind that moves through stages and eventually becomes something livable. It was a different kind entirely, a destruction. Total, comprehensive, and impersonal. The way of fire is impersonal. It did not care what it consumed. It simply consumed. My mother did not recover. She had built her entire life, her entire sense of what the world was, around two things: her husband and her belief that the world protects people who live in it honestly. Losing one destroyed the other simultaneously and completely. Within the month of my father's death, she had moved to her sister's house in Norwich. I watched her over the years that followed, become a smaller and quieter version of herself. Not in a dramatic, visible collapse, but in the gradual, almost imperceptible way of a candle burning down. Each time I visited, it was slightly less of the woman who had polished the banister every Sunday and known everyone on Beacon Road and believed, with simple and genuine conviction, that good people were held safe by the world they inhabited. She was not held safe. Neither was he. Daniel, 21 years old, studying the thing he loved. With his whole brilliant, laughing future apparently intact, dropped out of university within weeks of the verdict. He had been working evenings at a pub in town to help with the family's legal costs. And after the verdict, he simply did not go back to his course. He never said why. He stayed in Whitmore for a while, which I thought was the wrong decision, though I had no right to tell him what to do with his grief. He was living in the shadow of a name that was everywhere in that town, on the building on the high street, on the signage at the solicitor's, in every conversation about what had happened. He drank too much. He lost weight. He lost 2 jobs in succession under circumstances he did not explain to me. And I did not push, because pushing felt like cruelty. I could not have stayed. The town was too small and too familiar, and the Whitmore name was on a building I would have had to walk past every single day. And I was 23 years old with a law degree and a grief so large and so angry that if I had stayed in Whitmore, I would have done something that would not have helped anyone, least of all my father, so I moved to London. I found a job at a small firm in Clerkenwell that specialized in financial litigation, and I worked and I left. My colleagues over the years attributed what they called my dedication to professional ambition. I let them think that. It was easier than the truth. The truth was that every complex financial structure I learned to unpick. Every shell company I traced to its origins. Every manufactured paper trail I exposed. Each one was practice. Each one was a stone added to a wall I was building, a skill sharpened, a method refined. I was not climbing a career. I was preparing for a specific task. I passed my specialist qualifications in financial forensic accounting. I cultivated contacts at the Financial Conduct Authority, at investigative journalism outlets, in law enforcement. I built a professional reputation that opened doors. And all of it, every bit of it, had exactly one purpose. I kept my father's records, all of them. Every document he had kept in his careful, methodical way, every statement, every transfer record, every note he had made in his precise, old-fashioned handwriting. I had retrieved them from the family home before it was sold, and I kept them in a fireproof box in my flat in Clerkenwell. I read them periodically, not because I had discovered anything new, but because I did not want to forget the detail of what I was looking for. And because on the nights when 9 years felt like too long and the task felt like too much, reading my father's handwriting reminded me of exactly why it wasn't then. 8 months ago, on a Wednesday evening at 11:30, sitting at my desk in Clerkenwell, reviewing a routine financial disclosure for a client, I found it *I was reviewing a financial disclosure filed by a mid-sized property development company called Hardcastle Group. It was standard due diligence work. I was acting on behalf of a client who held shares in a rival firm, looking for irregularities in the expected places. It was the kind of work I had done hundreds of times. My eyes moved through the documents quickly and with a particular practiced focus of someone who has learned to read financial paperwork the way other people read novels, absorbing the structure and the rhythm and watching for the moment when something doesn't fit. Buried in the directorship disclosures for a subsidiary holding company, I saw a name: Aldermore Trust Ltd. Aldermore, the street in Whitmore where I was now, months later, renting a house. The same street my father's firm had managed property deeds for. A name too specific to be coincidence. A name that reached through the screen and took hold of something in my chest and squeezed. I set down my coffee. I looked at it. I pulled up the company's house record. Aldermore Trust Ltd. had been incorporated 18 years ago, 7 years before my father's trial. Its directors had changed over the years in the way that holding companies' directors often change. Shuffled and rotated to maintain a comfortable distance from any particular transaction. But one name had remained constant throughout every change. Listed always as a beneficial: OWNERS R. Whitmore. Sebastian Reginald Whitmore. I sat in my chair in my flat in Clockenwell and felt something rearrange itself inside my chest. Not excitement, not triumph. Something colder and more precise than either of those. The feeling of a key turning in a lock that you have been carrying for 9 years. I began to pull threads. I worked through the night and through the following morning, and into the afternoon, stopping only for coffee and once, briefly, to sit on the floor of my kitchen and gather myself. Aldermore Trust Ltd. had received 3 cash transfers over a period of 3 years, the same 3-year period as the fraud for which my father had been convicted. The transfers totaled precisely £460,000. Precisely, not approximately, not roughly, the exact same figure to the pound as the money my father had supposedly stolen. I traced the source of those funds through 2 intermediate accounts, chosen to complicate the trail in the way that people who understand financial investigation always try to complicate trails. And the source, the original source, the account from which the money had first moved, was the client trust account at Whitmore & Sons Solicitors. My father had not taken that money. Sebastian Whitmore had taken it, moved it through my father's access credentials, which Sebastian, as a junior partner at the firm in those years, would have been positioned to obtain, and when the discrepancy was discovered, had arranged for every piece of evidence to point at Martin Hartley. Asterisk, I stared at my screen for a long time after I understood this completely. Then I closed my laptop. I poured a glass of water that I did not drink. I sat down on my kitchen floor and I pressed my back against the cabinet. And I cried, not the raw, directionless weeping of the years immediately after my father died. That grief had been like drowning. No surface, no reference point, nothing to push against. This was different. This was focused. This was the cry of someone who has just confirmed in documentary detail what they have known in their bones for 9 years and had never been able to prove, and who can now finally, actually, with evidence in hand, stop carrying the uncertainty. I cried for exactly 12 minutes. I know this because I watched the clock, because even in that moment, I was the kind of person I had become. A person who keeps track of things. Then I got up off the floor. I rinsed my face. I made a cup of tea. I sat back down at my desk and I started making a plan. Asterisk, I spent 8 months preparing before I came back to Whitmore. 8 months of building the evidentiary case as thoroughly as I could from London, of mapping what I knew and identifying what I still needed, of planning for every scenario I could imagine and several I couldn't. I chose the house on Aldermore Lane for practical reasons. It was at the edge of town, away from the high street where I was most likely to be recognized. It was available for a long let, and its address would appear to anyone who looked into my rental records later as a small and satisfying message. I paid in advance with a bank draft drawn on an account and a name I had used for several years of professional dealings. Jane Marsh, which was not my name, but which was not fraudulent. Either in any way that would matter. The second bedroom became my operations room. 2 monitors. My father's records unpacked at last from their fireproof box and spread out across the desk and pinned to the board. A whiteboard with dates and names. A pinboard, red string and all. Yes, I know how it looks. But spatial thinking is how I work, and I am not apologetic about that, covered in photographs, document printouts, connection lines, and annotations. In the center of the pinboard was Sebastian Whitmore's photograph, a professional headshot from the Whitmore Capital website, taken in the artfully casual style that expensive photographers produce for wealthy executives. Blazer. No tie, a background of out-of-focus bookshelves meant to suggest intellectual seriousness. He was 56 in the photograph, silver-haired, composed utterly, secure in the belief that his position in this town and in this world was permanent. I looked at that photograph every morning when I began work in the 9 years since my father's death. Sebastian had used the stolen money as the foundation of a property portfolio that was worth, by my conservative estimate, approximately £6 million. He had left Whitmore & Sons 5 years earlier and established his own firm, Whitmore Capital, which dealt in investment management and private client services. He sat on the board of the local hospital trust. He chaired a scholarship fund for disadvantaged young people, which I found darkly, sourly, completely humorlessly funny in the way that certain things are too bitter to be anything else. He was in the town of Whitmore and in the broader county, a respected and successful man. He had built all of it on the bones of my father. I needed 3 things to complete what I had started. I needed a media ally, someone in local press who would handle the story correctly when the time came. I needed additional witnesses, people who had seen or known or suspected something in those years and had stayed silent. And I needed to complete the formal legal submission to the FCA, which I had been building for months and which was nearly ready, but which required the elements I did not yet have. I began with the newspaper, asterisk, on my 3rd day back in Whitmore. I walked into the offices of the Whitmore Gazette, the town's weekly newspaper, and asked to speak with the editor. I had spent time researching Thomas Aldridge before I approached him. He was 58 years old. He had been at the Gazette for 30 years, which in the modern media landscape is either a mark of exceptional loyalty or of someone who genuinely believes that what happens in a town of 12,000 people matters and ought to be documented. Everything I found suggested it was the latter. He was known in local journalism circles as stubborn, precise, and almost pathologically committed to getting things right. He was not glamorous. He was not ambitious in the way that leads people to larger outlets. He was apparently simply a man who had decided that his patch of the world deserved serious attention and had given it that attention for 3 decades. And there was the detail I had found in the archive. At the time of my father's trial, Thomas Aldridge had written a piece, brief, careful, tucked toward the back of the paper, that described the outcome of the proceedings without using the word guilty. He had used convicted instead. A single-word editorial choice that, in a small-town weekly, could easily have been overlooked. I had not overlooked it, in my experience. People who make that distinction between the verdict a court returns and the truth of a person's guilt are people who understand the difference and consider it worth marking. I gave the receptionist a false name and waited 20 minutes in a plastic chair beneath framed front pages before Thomas appeared, slightly breathless, with the harried look of a man who edits a newspaper largely by himself and is perpetually behind on something down in his office. With the door closed and the sound of the town going about its business muffled on the other side of it, I laid out the outline. Not everything. Not the documents, not the full evidential picture. Only enough for him to understand what I had and what I was building toward. I told him I had reason to believe that a prominent local businessman had committed financial fraud, that the fraud had resulted in the wrongful conviction of an innocent man, that I had documentary evidence, that I was working toward a formal legal submission, and that I would share what I had with the right journalist at the right time. but that I needed a few weeks and a commitment of discretion. Thomas Aldridge listened with the particular focused attention of a person who has learned to separate the claims people make from the evidence they can produce. He asked questions that were difficult and precise, the kind of questions that tell you someone is not just listening to what you are saying, but testing the structural integrity of it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Martin Hartley." I said nothing. "You're not Jane Marsh," he said. "Are you?" "I'm a woman who wants her father's name cleared," I said. "What I'm called is secondary to that." He looked at me for a long, considering moment. Then he said, "I wrote one piece. At the time, just the one. I thought something was wrong. The numbers in the prosecution evidence had a quality about them. It's a kind of over-precision that bothered me. But I didn't have anything to take it further, and I was, at the time, not in a position to pick a fight with the Whitmore family on instinct alone. What do you need? Asterisk, more than financial documents," he said. "For the story to hold, for it to survive any legal challenge before publication, I'd need testimony. People who saw something knew something. I'm working on that," I said. "That's why I'm here." A pause. He picked up a pen, looked at it, set it down. The gesture of a man who thinks better with something in his hands. "I'll wait," he said finally. "But I want first refusal on the story when you're ready." "You'll have it," I said. "And I mean that as a commitment, not a courtesy." He held out his hand across the desk and I shook it. And the handshake felt, in a way that may have been disproportionate but was entirely genuine, like the first solid thing in a very long time. I did not go looking for Margaret Doyle. I went to the supermarket on a Thursday afternoon for milk, bread, a ready meal, and the particular brand of instant coffee that I drink when I am working long hours and do not have patience for anything more involved. I was wearing a coat with the collar turned up, and I had cut my hair since the last time I had been in Whitmore. And I thought I had made myself sufficiently different from the girl who had grown up here that I could move through the supermarket without being recognized. Margaret found me in the biscuit. She was 64 with the round, weather-softened face of a woman who has spent considerable portions of her life outdoors. Gardening, I would learn later, was her great occupation of retirement, and the solid, capable hands of someone who has worked physically for most of their adult life. She looked at me with the direct, unsentimental gaze of a woman who has stopped spending energy on social performance. And then she said, without any preamble at all, "You're Martin Hartley's daughter." Every instinct I had said, deny it, give the false name, walk away. I had not come to Whitmore to be identified in supermarket aisles 3 days after my arrival. I had come to build a case in careful, protected privacy. And this woman had just punctured that. But there was something in the way she said it. Not as an accusation, not as a gotcha, as a recognition, careful, even gentle. Carrying the weight of something she had been holding for a long time and recognized a place to set down. "I can see it," she said, when I didn't respond immediately. "You have his forehead. And his way of holding yourself very upright. He always stood very straight." She said it as a compliment, the way it was meant. "You knew my father," I said carefully. "I was the office cleaner," she said, "at Whitmore and Sons for 16 years. A pause, deliberate, and waited. I left the year after your father went to prison. That's why," she said, "went to prison with a careful, controlled flatness that told me absolutely that she did not believe he had belonged there. I'd like to buy you a cup of tea," she said. "I have something you should hear, and I've been waiting a long time to say it to the right person." We sat in the cafe at the back of the supermarket. Fluorescent lighting, slightly overheated, laminated menus, and the smell of chip fat and industrial coffee. Completely unremarkable. Which was the best thing about it. Margaret wrapped both hands around her mug, the way people do when they are cold or when they need something to hold on to. And she looked at me steadily, and she told me what she had seen. "I was working late," she said. "I had a key. The partners all knew. I often worked evenings when the offices were quiet because it was easier than trying to clean around people during the day. This was the evening before the internal investigation was announced. I didn't know at the time that there was going to be an investigation. Nobody did. Outside the partners, but I know now that it was the night before, because I've gone back over the dates many times. She paused, steadied herself, went on. I came in to clean the back office. The partners' offices were on the first floor. Your father had an office at the end of the corridor. He wasn't a partner, but he had his own room because of the sensitive nature of what he managed. I was coming along the corridor when I saw the light was on under his door. You thought he was working late? I said, I assumed someone had left a light on, she said. Your father very rarely worked late. He was someone who kept regular hours and went home to his family. I pushed the door open. She looked at the table. Sebastian Whitmore was sitting at your father's desk, at your father's computer. He had papers spread around him. I could see they were account documents, the kind your father worked with. I don't know computers well enough to have known what he was doing on the screen, but he was concentrated, absorbed, like he was in the middle of something and didn't want to be disturbed. What did he do when he saw you? He heard me before he saw me. The door makes a sound when you push it, a particular creak. He came to the door very quickly, and he looked at me. She pressed her lips together, and in that small, compressed gesture, I saw 9 years of carrying something. I have thought about that look many, many times since then. It was not the look of someone who'd been caught doing something embarrassing. It was not embarrassment at all. It was a look of assessment. He was looking at me the way you look at something to determine whether it matters, whether it represents a problem, whether it needs to be dealt with. She met my eyes. He decided it didn't. He decided I didn't matter. And then he smiled at me very charmingly, very easily, the way he always did. And he told me I must have seen the light under the wrong door, that this was his office he was working in. His office was on the other side of the building, I said. I knew that, she said. I'd cleaned that building for 14 years at that point. I knew every office. I knew which door was which in the dark. She looked down at her mug. I should have said something at the time. I have told myself this every single day for 9 years. I should have gone to someone, the police, a solicitor, someone, and said what I had seen. But I was 64 years old and I had 2 grandchildren and a mortgage on a house in my name alone since my husband died. And he was Sebastian Whitmore and I was the cleaner. And I was frightened that no one would believe me. And I was frightened of what he might do if I spoke up. And so she stopped, took a breath. I said nothing. The silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who understand, both of them, exactly what silence costs. I'm not afraid now, she said. I'm 64 years old and my grandchildren are grown and the mortgage is paid. And I'm done being afraid of Sebastian Whitmore. She looked at me directly. Would you be willing to take a formal statement from me? I am, I said. But I have to ask you, are you prepared for what comes with that? It won't be quiet. When this breaks, it will not be quiet. Good, she said simply. It's been quiet for 9 years. I'm done with quiet. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers for a moment. I do not, in general, touch people I have just met. But some moments require it. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me, she said. I should have done it 9 years ago. This is not bravery. This is just very late. Daniel called on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after I had arrived in Whitmore, which told me that someone in the town had recognized me despite my precautions, and that the information had found its way to him. I was not surprised. I was not even, after my initial moment of sharp alert, particularly concerned. It had always been a question of when, not if. He was 30 years old now. He had Mom's dark eyes and Dad's stubbornness and the particular steadiness of someone who has been through the worst version of something and come out on the other side of it not unscathed. But standing? You should have told me, he said. Eleanor, you should have told me. I didn't want to involve you until I had something solid enough to stand on, I said. I didn't want to bring you into this and then not be able to deliver. That felt worse than going alone. I'm already involved, he said. I have been since I was 21. He took 9 years from me to Eleanor. Whatever you're doing, I want to help. I sat with the phone and thought about my brother as he had been at 21, the laugh. The architecture sketches spread across the kitchen table. The absolute unquestioning certainty of a young man who knew what he loved and was on his way toward it. I thought about what the years since had taken from him, and felt the particular grief of a sister who watched and could not fix it. "Are you sober?" I asked because I had to ask, because I would not bring him into this if he wasn't. And not because I didn't trust him, I would have trusted him with my life, but because I would not let this become something that hurt him further. 2 years, he said, with a quietness and a steadiness that told me it was true. 18 months officially by the program's count. But 2 years since I decided, since I sat in my car outside a pub in Derby at 11 o'clock at night and decided that it stopped being worth it. A pause. I'm proud of it. I worked hard for it. You can ask Eleanor. I'd rather you ask, asterisk. I'm sorry, I said, for asking. Are you in Whitmore? Yes. Then I'm coming. He arrived on Monday morning in a second-hand Volvo that he had bought the previous year when he had gone back to work. He was leaner than I remembered, and there were lines around his eyes that were entirely new. And his hair was cut short in the no-fuss way of a man who has made a quiet decision to stop spending energy on things that don't serve him. He stood in my doorway with his overnight bag over one shoulder and looked past me into the second bedroom where the pinboard was. And his face went through something complex and private that he did not share, but that I understood completely. Because I felt it too whenever I looked at that room. You've been building this for 9 years, he said quietly, not accusingly. Just noting it, acknowledging the size of it. 8 months with the hard evidence, I said. 9 years with everything else. He walked into the room. He stood in front of the board and looked at it for a long time at the names, the dates, the string, the photographs. He looked at Sebastian's professional headshot for a very long time without saying anything. Then he looked at our father's documents spread across the desk, in that careful, old-fashioned handwriting. When he finally turned around, his eyes were bright in a way that I recognized as the contained version of Daniel's feelings when he did not intend to let them out. "What do you need me to do?" he said. And just like that, for the first time in 9 years, I was not doing this alone. Asterisk, his name was Philip Mercer. He was 56 years old, thin-faced, precise in his manner, with a habitual slight tension of a person who has been carrying something uncomfortable for a very long time and has become so accustomed to the weight of it that he has almost stopped noticing it until someone asks, and then the weight becomes sharply apparent. Philip Mercer had been the junior accountant at Whitmore & Sons during the 3 years of the fraud. He had been 27 years old, young enough to be uncertain of what he was seeing, old enough to suspect it mattered. He had left the firm 6 months before the investigation was announced, in what the official record described as a voluntary resignation, and he was now working in semi-retirement at a small tax consultancy in Harrogate. And he had never spoken publicly about Martin Hartley or about what he had seen at Whitmore & Sons. I had spent 6 weeks establishing all of this before I drove to Harrogate on a Wednesday and sat in my car outside his offices for an hour. Preparing, I had decided to use my real name, not the false name I had been using everywhere else in Whitmore. My real name because I was betting, and it was a bet with everything riding on it, that Martin Hartley's name would mean something to Philip Mercer, and that what it meant would be important. I was right. He appeared in the reception area within 5 minutes of my name being given, and the flinch I saw cross his face, brief, quickly controlled, but unmistakable, told me that he had been waiting for exactly this conversation. Not necessarily from me, perhaps from anyone. Perhaps from the simple, forward-moving fact of time, which eventually brings all waiting to an end. We sat in his office with the door closed, and I told him what I had found. All of it. The Aldermore Trust, the transfers, the precise correlation between the funds moved and the funds my father had supposedly stolen. I laid it out the way I would lay it out in a legal submission, methodically, without drama, letting the facts carry the weight. He listened with his hands folded on the desk. His face was professionally still, the stillness of an accountant, a man trained to receive information without reacting until he has processed it. When I finished, he was quiet for almost a full minute. "I knew something was wrong," he said finally. His voice was quiet and even, in the way of someone delivering a verdict they have prepared for. I didn't have the full picture. I was 27 years old and still learning the work. And what I could see was that the numbers had a quality about them, a deliberate quality. Financial irregularities, in my experience, even fraudulent ones, tend to have a certain natural mesinzas about them. People cover their tracks imperfectly. The numbers don't quite add up in ways that look accidental. These were too clean, too precise. The kind of precision you see when someone is constructing a trail rather than concealing one. "You raised it internally," I said. "I did twice." He paused. "I was told both times that it was being handled by the partners, that I should continue with my work and not raise it further." He unfolded his hands, folded them again. 3 months after the second conversation, I was offered a severance package that was considerably more generous than anything my tenure entitled me to, along with a reference that described me in terms substantially above anything I had done to merit. He looked at the surface of his desk. I took it. I had a family. I was young. I told myself that if Martin Hartley was genuinely innocent, it would come out through the proper investigation. He paused. I believed that at the time because believing it was easier than the alternative. After, I knew I had been wrong to believe it. I knew it when the verdict came in. I knew it every year since. He looked at me directly, and in his face I saw the accumulated weight of 9 years of knowing and not acting. Not callousness, not indifference, but the kind of moral paralysis that comes from having missed the moment, when action was possible and not knowing how to find the next one. Your father was a good man. I knew him, not well, but enough. He was the kind of man who is immediately, obviously honest. It came off him the way heat comes off something warm. I knew he hadn't done what they said. I have known it with complete certainty for 9 years. And I did nothing. He stopped, swallowed. "I don't expect your forgiveness for that. I'm not asking for it. I'm not here for forgiveness," I said. And I meant it completely. I was not. I am here for the truth. The only question I'm asking you today is whether you are willing to help me get it. He looked at his hands for a long moment. The office was very quiet. "Kes," he said, "whatever I need to sign. Whatever statement, whatever testimony, yes." He looked up. "Tell me what you need, and after." Asterisk, the one I had not planned for, the one I had placed on my board as peripheral figure, possible collateral witness. Low expectation was Victoria Whitmore. I categorized her this way because her involvement in the mechanics of the fraud appeared, from everything I had found, to be secondary at most. She had married into the Whitmore family for years before the fraud began. Her access to the firm's financials would have been social rather than operational. She was the wife of an accessory, not a perpetrator. And while I had noted her on the board, I had not, truthfully, expected her to become significant. She proved me comprehensively wrong. Asterisk. The voicemail she left me arrived at 11:15. On a Tuesday night, the second Tuesday of my 5th. Weaken Whitmore in a voice. That was controlled in the way of someone deploying every tool of self-discipline to remain level. She gave her name. She said she believed I knew who she was. She asked to meet somewhere that was not Whitmore. She said she thought I would want to hear what she had to say. She asked for discretion. I sat with the message for 24 hours before I called back. Not because I was uncertain. I was going to call back from the moment I heard the message, but because I needed to think about what this meant, what it might be, and what my approach should be going in. Victoria Whitmore was not a potential witness I could approach on my own terms. She had approached me. That changed the dynamic considerably. We met at a hotel, restaurant in York, the kind of place where the tables are well spaced and the walls are thick, enough for private conversation, and the staff are professional enough not to hover. Victoria arrived before me and was already seated when I entered, a deliberate choice. I noted, made by a woman who preferred the power of watching other people enter rather than being watched entering herself. It was the kind of small, telling detail that in my work you notice. She was 52 years old, still beautiful. In the particular armored way of a woman who has made beauty a matter of discipline and principle rather than accident, who has maintained it with the same deliberate effort that other people maintain their professional reputations. She was impeccably dressed. Her hands, when she rested them on the white tablecloth, were steady. She waited until the waiter had brought menus and retreated. Then she said, "I know what Sebastian did. I have known for 4 years," said nothing. In my work and in this, the work that was not professional but was the most important work I had ever done, silence is always the correct response to an opening statement. It invites, it does not interrupt. It lets the person say what they came to say. "I found documents," she said. "In Edward's study, he has a study at the house full of papers he considers private. And I had never gone through them because I had never had cause to, and I respected what I understood to be the boundaries of a marriage. 4 years ago, I had cause." She did not elaborate on what cause, and I did not ask. Because it was not relevant, and because the particular flatness in her voice when she said it told me that whatever it had been significant. I found correspondence between Sebastian and Edward, from the time of the fraud, written physical letters, which I understand now was deliberate, because physical letters can be destroyed, but digital correspondence leaves traces. Sebastian was careful. He destroyed his copies. Edward apparently was not. Asterisk. What did the correspondence contain? I asked. Everything, she said. The arrangement, how it was done, the decision to use your father's access credentials, the discussions about what to do when the discrepancy was discovered, the decision explicit in writing to ensure that the evidence pointed at Martin Hartley rather than at the firm itself or at Sebastian. She set her hands flat on the tablecloth. My husband watched your father be tried for something Sebastian did. He sat through those proceedings knowing the truth, and he said nothing. And then your father went to prison, and my husband continued his life. And he has lived with that knowledge every day since. And I have been living for 4 years with the knowledge that he is living with it. Her voice remained level throughout. Perfectly, terribly level. The levelness of someone who has said these words to herself so many times, in the privacy of 4 years of increasingly hollow marriage, that they have worn smooth, all the rough edges gone, only the clean, terrible fact remaining. I have not had a marriage in any meaningful sense for the past 4 years, she said. I stayed initially because I did not know what to do, because I had documents that my husband would deny all knowledge of, against a man with very good lawyers, and I was alone. She looked at me directly. I have been waiting for someone who had the expertise to use what I have, someone with the skills to take it to the places it needed to go, someone with a reason, a personal reason, to see it through to the end, however long the end took and however difficult the road was. She paused. I have been waiting for you, Miss Hartley, or someone like you. I am glad it turned out to be you. I reached across the table and set my hand over hers. It was not a professional gesture. It was not strategic or calculated. It was simply the right thing to do at that moment, and I did it. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me, she said. I should have found a way to do this 4 years ago. All I ask is that you make it count. It will count, I said. I promise you that. Asterisk, 3 days after my meeting with Victoria in York, I became certain that Sebastian was aware of my presence in Whitmore. The first sign was a car, a dark blue saloon that I saw twice in my street within the space of a single afternoon, parked at different positions, occupied both times by a man I did not recognize but who had the air of someone being paid to be inconspicuous and not entirely succeeding. The second sign was the woman at the estate agent's where I had rented the house, on a routine visit to report a leaking tap. She looked at me with a particular careful attention, the look of someone who has been told to look. The third sign was the most unambiguous. My laptop flagged an attempted intrusion at 2:30 in the morning, which my security software blocked and logged, and reported to me with a sort of digital specificity that made the origin identifiable to someone with my training. I sat with these three things and assessed them without panic. I had known this was coming. I had always known that at some point, Sebastian, who was intelligent and who had maintained his position for 9 years through a combination of cover, strategy, and the intimidation of anyone who might otherwise have spoken, would become aware that something was happening. I had hoped for more time. I had prepared for less. I called Daniel. He was staying in a bed and breakfast on the other side of town. "He knows," I said. "What do we do?" "Nothing different. We accelerate." I called Thomas Aldridge. "I need 2 weeks from today. Can you hold?" "I can hold 2 weeks. Maybe 3 if necessary." "But Eleanor, 2 weeks," I said. "I'll have everything by then." I confirmed with Philip Mercer that his witness statement was finalized and ready for submission. I confirmed with Victoria that the documents, which she had moved at my request from the house she shared with Edward to a solicitor in London whom I trusted completely, were secured and available. I confirmed with Margaret Doyle that her statement was ready to be formalized. Then I made the most important call. Ruth Blackwood had been at the Financial Conduct Authority for 14 years. I had known her professionally for 5. She was one of those people in regulatory work who seemed to take the concept of financial integrity as something close to personal, not aggressive about it, not performative, just quietly and absolutely committed. She had the quality of a person who has a private reason for caring about what she does, though I had never asked her what it was. "I have everything," I told her. "I'm ready to submit the full package." A pause. "Then, we've been running a parallel investigation for 8 months since you first flagged Whitmore Capital. We've been careful. We didn't want to move until we had independent corroboration of what you were building. What you're bringing us will complete the picture. How soon can you move once I submit?" "Quickly," she said. "This has been in preparation for a long time." I stood at my kitchen window and looked at the rain that had been falling on and off since the morning I arrived in Whitmore. The garden was a ruin of dead grass and old leaves. Somewhere across the town, Sebastian Whitmore was sitting in his beautiful Georgian office and deciding what to do about me. I had not planned to confront Sebastian directly. Strategically, it was not necessary. Tactically, it was possibly unwise. It was the kind of thing that could give him information I hadn't intended to give him, could alert him to the specific shape of what I had, could prompt a response I wasn't prepared for. I knew all of this, and I went anyway, because there was a part of me, that was 22 years old and sitting across a kitchen table, watching my father hold himself very still, against the weight of a letter that was a lie that needed Sebastian Whitmore to look me in the face and understand who had done this. Not for justice. Justice was already in motion and did not require my presence. Not for satisfaction, exactly. For something else. For the part of this that was not evidentiary, that was simply true. My father deserved to be acknowledged. His daughter deserved to be seen. I called Sebastian's office on a Monday morning and gave my real name to his secretary. There was a pause of precisely 4 seconds. I counted, and then, "Mr. Whitmore will see you tomorrow at 2 o'clock. That he agreed to see me told me something. It told me that Sebastian, like most people who have held power for a long time, was still operating under the assumption that he could manage this. That he could sit across a desk from the daughter of the man he had destroyed and find a way to contain it. He had been containing things for 30 years. He believed he was good at it. I wore the dark gray suit I had bought specifically for this meeting. I drove to the Whitmore Capital offices, the handsome Georgian building on the High Street, the name in discreet gold letters on the door. The building that had been paid for, in part with my father's stolen life. I was shown up to the first floor by a secretary who did not make eye contact, which told me she had been told something about this meeting. Sebastian was standing when I entered. He was 57 years old, Silver-haired, well-dressed in the expensive, understated way of someone for whom the cost is irrelevant and the taste is refined. He radiated the kind of composed authority that very successful people cultivate over many years. The ease of someone who believes, and has always had reason to believe, that the space around him will accommodate whatever he requires of it. He looked at me with an expression I had heard Margaret describe and now saw for myself: pleasant. Blank, and behind both of those things, calculating. Absolutely calculating. "Miss Hartley," he said, "please sit down." "I prefer to stand," I said. "I won't be here long." He spread his hands in the gesture of a man who is entirely at his ease. "Then what can I do for you?" "Nothing," I said. "I haven't come here for anything from you. I've come to tell you that what's coming cannot be stopped. And I thought I'd decided that you should hear it from me rather than from whoever serves the papers." Something moved in his face. Brief, tightly controlled. "But there, and I saw it." "The FCA received a full submission as of this morning," I said. "The Crown Prosecution Service will receive one within 24 hours. Your correspondence with Edward Whitmore, which has been held securely for 4 years by someone who kept it rather than destroying it, which is the thing you relied on and the thing you miscalculated, Sebastian. Because you assumed that everyone around you would make the same choices you would make, is currently with our solicitor in London." "I don't know what you think you have." He began, "I have Aldermore Trust Ltd," I said. "I have the 3 transfers totaling precisely £460,000. I have the trace back to the client trust account. I have Philip Mercer's signed statement, describing what he observed and reported at the time and what was done to silence him. I have Margaret Doyle's witness statement. Placing you at my father's desk and computer the night before the investigation was announced." I paused for a single breath. "I have your letters to Edward. I have everything. Everything you thought was buried because my father is dead and my family fell apart and you believed. I think genuinely believed that death and devastation would be sufficient. That there would be no one left with both the will and the means to come back." The room was very quiet. The Georgian sash windows behind Sebastian framed the gray Whitmore afternoon perfectly. The town going about its ordinary business. The high street, the bakery, the church spire. The town that had always borne his name. "My father died in prison," I said. "I had rehearsed this. I had planned to deliver it with perfect control, and I did, though it cost me everything I had to do it. He was an honest and careful man who kept meticulous records because he believed, Kay, as you clearly did not, that records tell the truth. He died having never stopped believing that the truth would eventually come out. He died in the infirmary of a prison where he should never have been, of a heart attack at 53 years old. On a Tuesday morning, I held his gaze. My mother has spent 9 years becoming less of herself. My brother lost years of his life, years he cannot get back, years that were taken from him by what you did. I lost my father." Stopped. I looked at him for a moment. He looked back at me and his face was the most revealing I had ever seen it. Not because emotion was showing, but because of how completely it was not showing and what the effort of that cost him. "I'm not here to threaten you," I said. "I'm not here to ask you for anything. I'm here to tell you that what is coming, and that it was my father's daughter who brought it." I paused for the last time. "I thought you should know his name." Sebastian Whitmore did not say a word. I turned. I walked to the door. I opened it, walked through it, pulled it closed behind me. In the stairwell, out of sight and out of earshot, I stopped. I pressed my back against the cold wall. My hands were shaking, a fine involuntary tremor that I had not been able to prevent. I allowed it for 30 seconds, watching the second hand on my watch. Then I straightened my spine. I smoothed my jacket. I walked down the stairs, out into the gray Whitmore afternoon. Edward Whitmore did not go quietly in the days after the FCA announcement, which came 6 days after my submission. It's faster than I had anticipated. A sign of how thoroughly Ruth Blackwood and her team had been preparing Edward. Issued a statement through his lawyers describing the allegations as malicious and politically motivated. His lawyers sent letters, He gave a brief interview to a national newspaper in which he spoke about his family's long service to Whitmore and the surrounding community, about the injustice of accusations made without evidence, about his confidence that the process would vindicate him. He was, in those first days, performing the role of the wrongly accused with considerable professional skill. Then Victoria sent a letter of her own, through her own solicitor, a separate solicitor, a London firm of impeccable reputation, one she had engaged quietly 3 weeks earlier on my recommendation. The letter announced that she was providing full cooperation with the investigating authorities, that she held documentary evidence she would be making available immediately, and that she was pursuing divorce proceedings. The noise stopped. Edward Whitmore. I was informed by Ruth Blackwood in a telephone call that she delivered with quiet, professional satisfaction, had indicated a willingness to provide a detailed statement about Sebastian's role in the original fraud, the cover-up, the specific methods used to frame my father, and the subsequent distribution of the stolen funds in exchange for consideration of his cooperation. In the sentencing process, he was giving Sebastian up. I did not feel what I had expected to feel when Ruth told me this. I had imagined over the years that news like this would arrive accompanied by something large and clean: triumph, vindication, the satisfying click of everything falling into the right place. What I actually felt was more complicated and more tired, and underneath both of those things, a deep and genuine sadness. My father would never have made a deal. He would have stood in the truth and taken whatever came of it without negotiation, because he was constitutionally unable to be anything other than what he was. And here was Edward Whitmore, who had let my father go to prison and watched him die there. Here was this man, finally, after 9 years, choosing to tell the truth, and doing so because it served his interests, because it was the strategically optimal choice at this particular moment. Not because of conscience, not because of remorse. Justice is so often the byproduct of self-preservation. I thought about this, parked outside a newsagent's on the edge of town, and I cried for a few minutes, briefly and without drama. And then I started the car and drove home. Thomas. Aldridge's story ran on the front page of the Whitmore Gazette on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after my confrontation with Sebastian. The national press picked it up the same day, or rather, the same morning, because the stories went online simultaneously, and within 2 hours the piece had been shared several thousand times and was being reported by 3 national newspapers, 2 of which sent journalists to Whitmore before the day was out. The headline on the Gazette read, "Whitmore solicitor wrongly convicted, fraud evidence points to local." Businessman Thomas had sent me the draft the evening before. He had written it in the careful, precise way that characterized everything he did: factual, structured without sensationalism, but with a quiet and unmistakable moral clarity running through every paragraph. It described my father's conviction, the evidence of the fraud, the witness statements, the FCA investigation, the documents Victoria had provided. It used my father's name throughout. Martin Hartley. Not the victim, not the convicted man. His name. I sat at my kitchen table and read it 3 times. The second time, I was crying before I was halfway through, and I didn't stop until I finished. The third time I read it steadily, clearly, taking it in. Then I called my mother. She was at her sister's house in Norwich. She had the piece open on her laptop. Her sister had found it and brought it to her, and when she answered that phone, I could hear the particular quality of silence that surrounds someone who has been sitting very still in a room for a while. "Eleanor," she said. "I know." "Ma'am, they're saying," she stopped. Started again. "The paper is saying that he..." "It's true, Mom. All of it. Everything the paper is saying. It's all true." A silence that was very long and full, completely full of everything that a phone call cannot carry. I listened to my mother breathing across the 4-hour distance between us, and thought about number 14 Beacon Road and Sunday mornings and the smell of lavender polish on the banister and my father's reading glasses on the end of his nose. "He knew," my mother said finally. Her voice was the quietest I had ever heard it. Quiet and still and very clear. "Didn't he?" He always knew they'd done something. He used to say that the records would tell the truth eventually. That's what he told me in the visiting room near the end.
That was Eleanor's story, The Price of Silence, Episode 1. If this story moved you, if it kept you here for all 70 minutes, please hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss Episode 2. Eleanor's story isn't finished. Sebastian's trial is coming. Edward's cooperation has consequences. And there is one more secret in Whitmore that hasn't surfaced yet. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. See you next time.